Welcome to the panel exploring the new frontier space. My name is Jeffrey Huvnagel and I'm the conference chair. In December 2019, NATO declared space as its fifth domain of operations, together with land, sea, air, and cyberspace. The recognition underpins the importance of space, particularly in the security and defense field. Space-based assets have played an integral part in supporting multi-domain operations, ranging from intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions to command and control. Space goes beyond the field of security and defense and contributes significantly to agriculture, weather monitoring, crisis management, and so much more. More than ever is there a need for a comprehensive and unified approach because the space domain is faced with unparalleled and unprecedented threats. Today's security environment has become more volatile, multifaceted, and complex, with the rapid proliferation of emerging technologies which can provide new opportunities and present new challenges, such as the hacking and weaponization of satellites. Additionally, disruptive technologies can interrupt satellites and disrupt military operations as well as communications. Deputy Chairman of the NATO Military Committee, Lieutenant General Scott Kinsvater, stated it best. In June this year, defense ministers agreed NATO's first ever space policy. They recognize that space is part of our daily lives. And while it can be used for peaceful purposes, it can also be used for aggression. Satellites can be hacked, jammed, or weaponized. Anti-satellite weapons could cripple communications. It is therefore important that we are vigilant and resilient, also in space. However, there's far more than just NATO. Today, we're going to take a unique look into China's space capabilities, the work of the European Union Satellite Centre, and the UK space policies, all providing their own take on space. To discuss this topic in depth, I would like to welcome the following speakers. Flavio Gudici, a space scientist at the NATO Communications and Information Agency, was one of the experts that contributed to the development of NATO's space policy. Dennis Bruckert is Copernicus coordinator and the head of Copernicus unit at the SATCEN since June 2004. He's representing the SATCEN at the partner board and he's contributing to the working group in support to the external action and border monitoring driven by the Copernicus unit. Brendan Mulvaney is the director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute. Dr. Mulvaney served as a Marine for a quarter of a century, where he flew more than 2,000 hours as a AH-1W Cobra pilot and was an Olmsted scholar in Shanghai, China. Flavio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Geoffrey, and good afternoon and good morning to those who are following from the US. Thank you for the invite to speak at this conference. I'm Flavio Giudice, space and astronautical engineer by background, and I've been working on space for NATO since 2016. First at Shape J3 and now at NCIA in The Hague on operation support. In these last 6 years, I've been collaborating with NATO HQ, the strategic commands, the nations on many aspects related to space. As mentioned, from the development of policies to space support in operation, NATO exercises, and now on the implementation of space as an operational domain. As a direct player, I will be glad to provide you with an overview of NATO approach in this domain, as well as a view on future challenges driven by emerging technologies. As you know, space has received increasing attention in NATO in the last years, especially after it was recognized as an operational domain in 2018. However, space is not new to NATO, and even the NATO space policy, which was discussed very broadly on internet, is not really the first NATO policy on space matter. NATO as an organization has been working on space since the 60s and owning satellites since the 70s. More specifically, NCIA has operated NATO satellites until 2015, and still today we operate satellite ground station and a satellite center. Currently, though, NATO doesn't own any satellite, but receive data, products, and services, mostly from the nations, sometimes on voluntary basis, and sometimes based on formal agreements.
However, given the technological advancement of the last 10 years, I would say, in the future, this approach could change towards a more balanced mix of national and commercial capabilities. For NATO, space is a critical force enabler, which serves all the other operational domain. In particular, the space domain includes 6 functional areas, as we call them. And I will start from SATCOM, satellite communication, that allows beyond line of sight command and control, including, for instance, the RPA operations, or operation of remotely piloted aircraft like NATO AGS that flies from Sicily. Then we use intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance satellites for intel collection over areas of interest where without the need for overflight authorization. Then the third functional area is PNT, positioning, navigation, and timing, which is provided by the US with GPS and is critical for friendly force tracking and navigation, synchronization of systems, including SATCOM itself, and targeting, and I'm thinking, for example, of precision-guided munitions. Then we have METOC, which is meteorology and oceanography. We use weather satellite for weather forecast. And when I talk about weather, I mean both terrestrial and space weather. Space situational awareness is critical for force protection because it's intended within NATO as the knowledge of the position of space objects. And last but not least, the shared early warning capability for missile defense. So this is just to say that, to highlight that NATO and NATO nations highly rely on space. And this reliance is expected to grow as performance of space services improves. So if space support were to be denied, the level of warfare would downgrade, and the resources necessary to achieve the desired end state will increase dramatically, as well as the risk to personnel, both military personnel and civilian. And talking about civilian, the disruption of space services would affect also this sector, the civilian sector, will have significant political, psychological, and economic consequences. And this is even more true in NATO countries, given the pervasive use of space services, especially in the future after the 5G and Internet of Things will be more spread. So in this sense, space must be seen as a military center of gravity, and as such should be defended. NATO's dependency upon space indeed drives potential adversary to continue developing counter-space capabilities, as they recognize that space superiority is a strategic advantage. But threats are not only anti-satellites weapon, they are also wrong behavior in space. In this sense, NATO is assessing legal consideration to address this issue. But I won't talk about this today because I will rather focus on technology aspects which are closer to my daily work. As you know, space is experiencing a paradigm shift from big satellites owned by a nation, often considered a valuable target by potential adversaries, to constellation of hundreds or even thousands of small satellites, which will be mostly in low Earth orbit and will be more resilient, easily replaceable, and less vulnerable to certain types of threats. These new space constellations are mostly owned by commercial companies and will allow new application, I would say. I'm thinking about, for example, real-time persistent global coverage for ISR with resolutions that will go as low as few centimeters, depending on the decision of the legislator on this matter, but most likely it will be the case. I'm thinking about high throughput SATCOM over areas of interest that today are not really well served by SATCOM, like the Arctic region. Commercial navigation already today there are capabilities that are for some aspect less jammable than governmental. And space-based signal intelligence is another example of a capability that today is available commercially, but was exclusive to a few nations just 2 or 3 years ago. So everything sounds great, right? However, if on one side this democratization of space will offer great opportunities, on the other side it will also present challenges. It will, for example, imply that state and non-state actors will be able to access service without even owning a satellite. Additionally, to fully exploit the amount of data that will be available from space, it will be needed to use more and more artificial intelligence and machine learning. We have to think that today already, with the 3,500 satellites in orbit, there are not enough analysts to exploit the imagery available. And with the number of satellites forecasted to reach 100,000 by the end of this decade, orbital traffic management will be crucial, especially with the introduction of satellites capable of performing orbital maneuvers autonomously. Not only this, given that, as mentioned before, the majority of this satellite will be in low Earth orbit, the competition over the spectrum will increase, potentially creating also even tensions between the nations. So we have to think that LEO orbits, so low Earth orbits, are less regulated than the geostationary orbit. So, for example, there is no international regulator of orbital slots. And to make things even more complicated, the majority of satellites will be owned by private companies. Today, SpaceX already owns 25% of the operational satellite, and Amazon invests in space as much as France. So commercial actors are now the primary stakeholders in space. And therefore, one of the main challenges will be to identify a framework for space governance that takes into account this shift. Space, as we know, is a shared domain, and action by one actor can have long-lasting consequences for all. Therefore, a truly global approach is needed to make space reliable and predictable. And here, I think that is where NATO can play a role. So, given this increasing criticality of space systems for both military and civilian application, NATO decided to approve the overarching space policy and recognize space as the fifth operational domain. These decisions were taken to strengthen NATO deterrence posture, better integrate space in the operational planning process, and address legal aspects, but most importantly, to prepare the alliance to face these future challenges. It should be noted, I think this is the most important point, is that having technological superiority, which NATO today has, the NATO nation have, doesn't correspond necessarily to having strategic advantage. The strategic advantage is given by the ability to integrate new technology into the military architecture and to do it faster than adversaries. So for NATO, in order to maintain this strategic advantage, the alliance needs to speed up the mechanism to employ new technologies in operations. That's the reason why NATO is coordinating actions with the nations to ensure the right level of provision of space services. And in particular, I can speak for the agency that I work for. NCI is constantly collaborating with the nations and the industry and investigating new capabilities and commercial partners with their commercial partners. The agency is managing investment today worth 2 billion euros only for space. These are for providing SATCOM to the alliance through our ground stations. But not limited to this, it's not limited to SATCOM. We are also providing space products and services across the other space functional areas. Additionally, as a NATO CIS provider, the agency develops application and systems that guarantee the integration of these space products and services into NATO's architecture, ensuring interoperability between NATO and national system. And this is something of great importance because it happens very often. The national services are not compatible with each other or with the system used by NATO. So we can say that NCIA is the technological hub for space in NATO. And that's why we are following from very close this evolution of space technology, because we need to maintain the alliance at the technological edge to guarantee the best service delivery. NCIA has the responsibility to ensure that NATO is enabled to operate in the space domain. We don't do operation by ourselves, but we enable the operators to do their work, to respond promptly to threats and capitalize on new technology opportunities. This is something that we do constantly, looking at current operation, of course, but also looking at the future in the long term. For example, by integrating space and space capabilities into the AFSC, the Alliance Future Surveillance Capability, which is the program that aims at replacing NATO AWACS after 2035. So pretty long term, I would say. So in conclusion, as the space ecosystem evolves, NATO also adapts to this change, keeps organizing itself to better defend the alliance with, for example, a new space center in Ramstein, coordinating space domain awareness with the nations and the most relevant entities, and soon also with the Space Center of Excellence in France. And CIA in this ecosystem contributes by leading the technological effort. And I would like to conclude by saying that despite what was written on internet, a secure space domain is the real aim of NATO. Guaranteeing a reliable space domain is a win for all, not only for NATO. And I will stop here because I could speak forever, but I think that my time is over. So I will be glad to answer your question at the end of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. Dennis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Geoffrey. So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I will check is it working when I share the presentation? Okay, perfect. So first at all, I would like to thank the Atlantic Forum for having inviting me and the SATCEN to this conference and to the space panel. It's a pleasure, an honor, and also a great opportunity to exchange on the value of space to support security in the EU, but also around the world, I think. So in this presentation, I propose to bring a kind of insight of what we are doing at the EU Satellite Center, and also in cooperation with the Copernicus program. I will say a few words about Copernicus. So a brief tour d'horizon of our activities. And I would like to start with a fact. It's that today, and I think for everybody, space is a strategic issue. And this has been, highlighted by the High Representative Josep Borrell at the European Space Conference in Brussels last year. In fact, the EU has a solid track record to act together through different components, Copernicus, the Earth observation program, Galileo, navigation system, and also through the EU Satellite Center, which is a geospatial intelligence asset for the EU. So let's enter a little bit more into the details of the SATCEN. We are an intergovernmental agency serving EU common foreign and security policy. The agency is located near Madrid in Spain, and our mission is to support the decision-making and action of the European Union in the field of common and foreign security policy, in particular the common security and defense policy, including, and that's important, the European Union crisis management missions and operation. And we do this, we provide the support via products and services resulting from the exploitation of space assets, which include, of course, satellite imagery, aerial imagery, and related service. So we have a very long-standing experience, more than 25 years, in geospatial intelligence, which we could put under security from space. But also more recently, or even for already some years, we are also developing service related to security in space, such as space surveillance and tracking, to ensure, of course, the security of our satellites, which are critical assets for the EU citizens and for our security also. So that's a very important point. So our core activity is geospatial intelligence, but we are also very much involved, and it's going along with training, capability development, including research and innovation, as well as information technologies. We are working, of course, like many others, on artificial intelligence, deep learning, big data, and any other methods, emerging technologies that could support our work. And we are cooperating with the EU and international partners, and I will come back to this later. So now looking at the products and service we deliver, those on these slides, of course, are not sensitive. They have been sanitized, but we are also handling classified data. And here you can see some example of what we are doing, for example, in the activities such as supporting counter weapons of mass destruction, our support to the Frontex agency in the analysis of refugees camp, and the support to the EU NAVFOR-Med operation, which is now the IRINI operation, in fact, on the implementation of the UN arms embargo on Libya through the use of aerial satellites and maritime assets. So we support strongly IRINI today. And regarding the demand from our users, we've noted a quite important increase through the years, and the impact of the pandemic, in fact, has not lowered the demand. At the contrary, we saw an increase, and we believe that we can link this to the fact that the lack of mobility on the ground have suscitated increasing needs for remote geospatial intelligence. So, very important to highlight also that everything is done in cooperation with our key partner in the EU, such as the European Commission, of course, through the EU Space Programme, Copernicus, Space Surveillance and Tracking, cooperation with the agencies, Frontex, EMSA, the European Fishery Agency also, and also participation in the Research and Innovation Horizon 2020, now Horizon Europe program. And we have arrangement with the European Defence Agencies, European Space Agency. We are participating in the group of Earth observation, etc. So cooperation is really key for us. We have cooperation in research and innovation, but also operational cooperation. And we do not have yet formalized a cooperation with NATO, but I would like to underline that the SATSEN legal framework specifically enable to cooperate with NATO. NATO is mentioned in our Council decision in the different partners which we could establish cooperation. So the door is open for future cooperation. So now I would like to say a few words on a very important new feature in the European Union. It's the EU space program. The EU space program will develop through 2021-2027. And there are a lot of good news. First is that the budget is more than 14 billion euros, so it's an important budget which will enable really to go ahead in this so strategic area of space. The second good news, I would say, is that it's bringing together within a common framework programs that were separated before and which are extremely strategic, such as the navigation, Galileo program, Earth observation, Copernicus, satellite situational awareness, and space situational awareness, and GovSatcom. Also to be highlighted that the program clearly include in its objectives to enhance safety, the security of the Union and its member states, reinforce its autonomy, in particular in terms of technology, and we have also evidence-based and independent decision-making. So I think a big step forward in this strategic area of space for the European Union. And at this point, I would like also to highlight the excellent continuity at high level and under high-level stakeholders' leadership in the EU. This is reflected in the declaration of the High Representative Josep Borrell, the Satellite Center Director Sorin Ducaru, Director General DG DEFIT at the Commission, and Mr. Thierry Breton. And all are strengthening our capacity in the EU and with Copernicus to act together for the benefit of the EU citizens and for the benefit of the policies. SATCEN being entrusted with a key part of those objectives, which is to support the EU external action. So some details about Copernicus, but in entering into what at the role of SATCEN there. I think it's important to highlight that Copernicus is a system of systems, including several components. The space component, of course, with dedicated satellites, which are the Sentinel satellites, not very high resolution, but can be used in security as complementary data. And also all the contributing mission, where you will find all the commercial satellites, for example, with a very high resolution up to 50 centimeters, very, very useful for the security service. So it's quite a broad program, providing service from atmosphere monitoring up to security, and SATCEN is of course in particular involved in the security pillar of Copernicus. So Copernicus is supporting many EU policies, providing decision-making for the key challenge that the European Union is facing: climate change, maritime environment, disasters, and security. And in the security pillar, we have three services: border surveillance, maritime surveillance, and support to EU external action. SATCEN has been entrusted to operate the Copernicus service in support to external action and is also involved in a border surveillance through a partnership. We have a strong partnership with Frontex. So let's say a few words about border surveillance. Border surveillance is provided through Frontex, and the service are delivered to member states authorities such as the Border and Coast Guard. And here SATCEN is providing several services, 6 operational services ranging from quite monitoring of pre-frontier and coastal areas, but also several mapping service and also analytical assessment of migration. Now I go to the service that the Satellite Center has been entrusted within Copernicus, which is a Copernicus SEA. support to external action. So this service includes support to common foreign and security policy and to the security and defense policy of the Union. It's fully operational today. It's a geointelligence service. And if you want more information, I will give you quickly, the key information on the service, but I encourage you really to visit the website. Here you will find the full details of the service, and you will be also, if you are interested for using the service, you can also contact through the website, the EU Satellite Center. So to resume, today we are providing service in 6 domains: support to humanitarian aid, rule of law, stability and resilience for development, security of the EU citizens abroad, crisis, conflict and critical assets, and also cultural heritage. And I can illustrate with these figures the strong support the service is providing today. First at all, we have been activated by our users already more than 350 times, delivering more than 700 products over 66 countries areas. And you can notice obviously that those areas where the service has delivered the most are outside the European Union, where conflict, instability and unrest are present. You can also notice that there is a balanced user by the service by common foreign and defense policy missions and operations, the member states, and the EU External Action Service. Here, you will find 2 practical examples. The first one is more related to the environmental compliance, environmental crime, which is very important. It shows support to a user in controlling illegal waste management using the analysis and change detection based on high-resolution satellite imagery over illegal landfill. And this is a pilot project we are currently developing for a member state. The second one is more external action oriented. It's addressing the evaluation of damage after a conflict outside the European Union. In this case, it's the analysis in Cameroon of an area where human rights violations were occurring. So these products provide actionable decision-making intelligence to support the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Human Affairs. So that's just 2 examples. We already provided more than 700 products, but it's 2 examples focused on 2 different areas, such as I would say environment and also a conflict. So this is my last slide, and I'd like to share a little bit what we are foreseeing for the future. We are now at the beginning of the new phase of Copernicus within the EU space program. And we will take benefit of this new phase to enter into the evolution of Copernicus support to external action. So we plan to address a new area, very strategic for the EU, such as climate and security, as well as pandemic mitigation and monitoring. And we want to address also the needs regarding the nexus between internal security and external security. So some areas have been widened. For example, the security of the EU citizen is not only considered outside the European Union, but also within the European Union in the future. So it's quite evident that those area policies need support with high quality geospatial intelligence, and the SATCEN expertise with a partnership with Copernicus is definitely a key asset for the EU and for the member states to address those future challenges. So with this, I finish my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I keep available for any question.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Brendan, the floor is yours. You'll have a very interesting topic on Chinese space capabilities.
I think I don't have sound in the turn.
Yeah, I think Jeffrey's on mute.
Okay.
Apologies. Brendan, the floor is yours. You'll have a very fascinating presentation on Chinese space capabilities. Please enlighten us.
Great. Well, thanks. Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are in the world. I'd like to thank the Atlantic Forum for the invitation to talk today. First, I'll give the quick disclaimer that while my day job is the director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute, today the views are, of course, my own and don't reflect the policies of the U.S. government necessarily, but are based on the reading the material that comes out of China as well as other countries as well. So as we all know, and we've talked about today, access to space has got great economic and scientific and military advantages and advancements to all the nations that have been able to achieve it. Previously a small club, but growing and growing, as we've already talked about today. So primarily that meant the Soviet Union and the United States and their allies in partnership. But as technology has advanced and access to space has become more affordable, nations like China and India have really pushed to enter the previously elite club and gained a lot of those same benefits, while potentially weakening or eliminating some of the advantages that the United States, NATO, and Europe held for a long time. So China's space ambitions are no secret. And while China's been a space power for decades, and has built up an inventory of over 350 satellites in orbit since its first launch, it's really seen a resurgence in this in the 21st century and a continued expansion under General Secretary Xi Jinping. This includes not only China's ambitious scientific exploration programs that we've seen going to the dark side of the moon, returning Earth samples back to Earth, et cetera, but also in the commercial and the military realm as well. Over the course of the last decade or so, China has emerged as a major space power, and since 2009 has consistently launched more than 10 rockets a year, reaching an all-time high of 32 in 2019. And this is while only 15 of the 29 NATO countries actually operate satellite. So China, in fact, recently just launched a reusable space plane that they launched from their Jiuquan launch center. So this is a fairly large achievement and shows just the amount of development that the Chinese space program has undergone. All of this is really meant to enable China to expand its ability to project power in all meanings of that word, right? Economic, diplomatic, and military around the world and farther from China than it ever has before. China hasn't released its space great power strategy yet, but projects such as the National Civil Space Infrastructure Mid- and Long-Term Development Plan and the Space Earth Integrated Network Information Mega Project point to a resilient system of systems that will allow data sharing between space, air, sea, and ground assets, including unmanned vehicles, which is obviously new for all of us, for both economic and defense purposes. And I continue to talk about the duality of both of those, right? So there's economic and scientific purposes, but they are closely tied to defense and security. The Mega Project is an integrated network that will support 4 application areas. So that includes spacecraft, guided missiles, near space flight vehicles, as well as, like I said, the UAVs. On the defense side, China's 2019 Defense White Paper specifically highlighted space as one of the most important arenas for comprehensive national power. China realizes that space spans the gamut from scientific to commercial and defense and military, and calls space a, quote, critical domain in international strategic competition. So those are China's words and how they're describing it. So when we talk about the space program in China, we have to understand that all aspects of it serve the Communist Party of China, the CCP. And we can't make the clear distinctions that would otherwise be the norm in Western democracies throughout Europe. Indeed, China sees space as critical to all aspects of its national security. And that same white paper said that outer space security provides strategic assurance for national and social development. So they're all tied to the ability of China to develop and maintain and utilize the advantages that come from the national space program. And we have to remember that in the PRC, it's the Communist Party that controls the levers of government, military as well as the economic sector. And in fact, even if a sector or technology isn't controlled or dominated by a state-owned enterprise, even some of the commercial companies are obligated to assist in the construction of the Chinese state, and they do this through a thing called the Military Civil Fusion System. CACI released a report on MCF, and the impact is wide-ranging. And in fact, in a journal article in 2017, a Chinese Academy of Sciences academician highlighted this very dual-use characteristic of space-based information network, noting that the development of the position, navigation, and timing sensing system can significantly advance military-civil fusion, and he underscored the project's enormous economic potential as well as the national security implications. So it's really been a long time since the United States and its NATO allies and partners faced a real challenge in space. For nearly half a century, it was really only the Soviet Union that challenged us in any meaningful way for control or freedom of use. And even that was relatively mitigated. Indeed, neither the Soviets or Russia now, or the US until recently, gave much consideration to the vulnerabilities of space-based capabilities, and always kind of believed that the advantages far outweighed these vulnerabilities. This led to program and acquisition decisions that resulted in large, exquisite, but very expensive space systems that were designed to last decades. And the full prowess of US space supported capabilities was shown during Desert Storm, where space-based GPS enabled precision targeting day or night, constant reliable communications and information flows back and forth, real-time intelligence, and the US and our allies were really able to decimate what was the world's sixth largest military very rapidly. So by many accounts, this was actually the shock that prompted Jiang Zemin, who was then General Secretary of the Communist Party, into action, and this is what resulted in the great push for the PLA's modernization. 3 decades of that modernization effort have really led to the creation of the People's Liberation Army's Strategic Support Force, which focuses on what Xi Jinping calls the, quote, new commanding heights of modern warfare, and that's space. And it's safe to say that its U.S. and its allies and partners now face a near-peer or peer competitor. In November 2019, as we talked about, NATO recognized space as an operational domain, declaring it similar to air, land, and sea, and it's now recognized as essential to the alliance's defense and deterrence, which is important to underline there. This coincided with an increasing commitment to space by several NATO members, in particular France, the UK, and Germany. But Chinese military strategists believe that the best way to deter or defeat adversaries in modern warfare would be to hold at risk its space assets, precisely because the U.S. and our allies have become to rely on them so heavily, because they do deliver such a decisive advantage to NATO forces. Few powers are able to do this effectively, but China is one of them. To quote the U.S. Defense Space Strategy, China has weaponized space as a means to reduce U.S. and allied military effectiveness and challenge our freedom of operation in space. So what kind of programs does China have? The answer I like to give is all of them. In the military, we like to talk about the kill chain, and this is the idea that a specific munition that must be defeated or protected against isn't the sole issue, but rather all the links in the chain that allow that specific munition to find, fix, and kill its intended target. This includes sensors to detect and identify. It includes the command and control to make the decision as to whether to launch or not, when to launch, and what platform to launch from, as well as any guidance or navigation that's enabled to require the mission to reach its target. And on today's battlefield, nearly all aspects of that chain rely on space in part or in whole, and that's true throughout the NATO alliance. China's view on space as part of the space as part of the skill chain as well. It's not only a domain of warfare, but it's part of the entire system of information systems, which is how they conceptualize this competition. That's not to say that the physical assets of space aren't important, but even more important sometimes are the data flows that go to and from space. And while we like to talk about anti-satellite or ASAT weapons, really a better description is counterspace. And that's because that uses this idea of the kill chain to examine all of the ways that a nation could threaten or attack or defeat another space-enabled power. So, of course, there's the traditional ASAT weapons we talked about, which are missiles launched from the Earth targeting assets in space. And we saw one that China tested in 2007, and India tested one just a decade later. There's co-orbital ASAT systems. These are space-based assets, typically maneuvering satellites that can move in such ways to disrupt, to physically harm, or even destroy another satellite. We've seen recent activity by a Russian satellite that very easily could have been a test for this system, and China has these same systems as well. In fact, one of those possible systems was on open display at the 2018 Zhuhai Air Show, and I got a pretty good picture of it. So we know that China has these, and they're openly discussing their use. But there's also non-kinetic methods that can cause damage to space assets, like high-power microwave weapons, which can destroy the circuits within the satellite and the system, but leave the exterior physically intact, blinding or dazzling with a laser. These can be both temporary or permanent, which is really depending on what the attacker wants to accomplish, and they have the potential benefit of being plausibly deniable. China has plenty of systems focused on electronic warfare, include jamming of satellites to or from the satellite, which could be reversible or permanent, as well as spoofing the position navigation and timing, which China has today. And of course, there's cyber attacks, which can target all of those data systems by using and uploading malicious code, the ground stations that are used for telemetry tracking and control, as well as skipping the space-based parts altogether and simply targeting the end users and their equipment. Because again, it's the data flows back and forth from space that we rely on. So if we look at the 2000 edition of The Science of Campaigns, which is a textbook put out by the Chinese Academy of Military Science, it concludes that to cripple or destroy the enemy's information system would drastically degrade the enemy's combat capabilities by making it blind, deaf, or paralyzed. So developing the capability to degrade an enemy's reconnaissance capabilities early in the stages of conflict appears to be a major priority for these Chinese planners. This will rely on precise tracking of enemy satellites. China's ground segment, and particularly the space situational awareness component, will play a vital role in Chinese military space operations. So what does this mean for NATO planners? It means that space is no longer the sanctuary that it once was. And indeed, many of the systems and the systems of systems that we've come to rely so heavily on for modern warfare since the 1990s may well not be available or not be as reliable as we've counted on for decades. Commanders and operators at all levels need to understand the impact of this issue and to develop tactics, techniques, procedures, doctrine, and most importantly, training that takes this into account. To date, only one NATO ally, France, has publicly stated the intention to develop counter-space weapons. And so this is an issue that we need to talk about as we go forward. Moreover, certain space capabilities operated by Europe are not under NATO command, as we just heard, right? So that the Galileo satellite system, for example, is operated by the EU, which includes some NATO allies, but also has non-NATO countries as well. And the Space Surveillance Tracking Service it has eight members and 51 sensors, which includes, again, some but not all NATO allies, and not all of them, all the member countries are NATO allies. So just something to think about. So quickly, let's talk about how China views and uses space situational awareness. The ground segment for China's space programs has expanded dramatically. The last 10 years have seen remarkable growth in the number and the sophistication of these ground stations needed to support China's scientific and defense-related space programs. This includes those within China, as well as an expanding network, which includes some NATO countries and allies and partners. So examination of commercial satellite imagery of stations built prior to the period has seen an expansion of their capabilities through antennas and other infrastructure. New stations have been set up, existing stations have been expanded, and based on simply the public plans, this momentum seems likely to continue. As technology improves, and especially high-quality optics, as we heard about earlier, as well as more powerful lasers become cheaper, there's likely to be a shift in the shape of China's space infrastructure. So worldwide, there's an ongoing shift away from the large, expensive stations that I talked about to networks of small but cheap optical or radar satellite tracking stations become more popular. These stations will not reduce the need for those large installations, which are necessary for deep space missions, but it will mean that China can build easily redundant and highly accurate systems to track satellites as well as space debris. The ground segment is largely operated by the People's Liberation Army. The organization believed to operate the majority of China's space ground infrastructure is the Satellite Launch and Tracking Control Systems Department. It manages China's space tracking network and its launch centers. And while outwardly portrayed as an independent civilian organization, there's strong indications that it is a major component of, or potentially synonymous with, the Strategic Support Forces Space Systems Department. A fundamental reason for China's ground segment is to help China maintain space situational awareness. The PLA, and specifically the Strategic Support Force Space Systems Department, plays a major role in launch, tracking, command, and long-term operations. As the PLA continues to modernize its path toward informatization and eventually intelligentization, right? We talked about all of the information coming and how we're going to need AI and big computer power to help develop that. Space systems will continue to play an even greater role, necessitating the PLA's continued involvement in both the defense and the civilian space infrastructure programs. Many components of this segment are involved by providing SSA, from avoiding detection of enemy satellites to maintaining communications with key satellite relays, and it's an important factor in any country's ability to prosecute and win wars in the future. Military early warning radars, which scan the skies for incoming missiles, also provide information on objects in low Earth orbit, such as satellites and debris. China is also developing space-based SSA assets. These include the Tianlian series of data relay satellites, which China has launched in part to help improve communications and reduce reliance on foreign tracking stations. The first in this constellation was launched in January 2003, the second in 2008, and the system reached an initial global coverage with the third in 2012. The second generation was launched in 2019, and all of these satellites sit in geostationary orbit and operate very similarly to those ground stations, but they offer significantly better coverage without some of the challenges of a ground-based system. Finally, we need to emphasize that SSA has military implications. Identifying a reconnaissance satellite's orbit can provide sufficient time to take measures to conceal sensitive systems, for personnel to camouflage themselves from visual, infrared, or radar sensors. And most worryingly, precise characterization of an orbit is also vital to conducting attacks against that satellite, whether kinetic or a jamming attack or dazzling attacks. Access to ground stations also provides the potential for hacking attacks through connections used to those satellites. Network databases of imagery and other data collected from satellites are also very vulnerable to these hacking attacks. As one Chinese article put it, SSA is the continuous preparation of the battle space in order to fight and win a war in space. So we see, even when nominally civil or for safety reasons, China sees ways to leverage it for military purposes. And in order to mitigate the risk from debris, in 2015, the Chinese Academy of Sciences set up the Space Debris Monitoring and Application Center. This is set up by SASTN, which is the parent organization of their version of NASA, the CNSA, as well as the National Astronomical Observatory, which jointly manages the center. And it's believed to be the leading organization in charge of China's space debris avoidance system. It provides early warning and analysis for more than 100 of Chinese satellites tracking space debris, maintaining an independent catalog of all objects in space. But the announcement of the center's establishment also noted that it can monitor not only debris, but things much larger, such as missiles, satellites, and high-speed aircraft. And this is in China's own words. So in other words, this center has both civilian and military functions. In peacetime, it provides situational awareness for Chinese satellites in orbit. And in wartime, it can provide early warning and coordinates for the People's Liberation Army to destroy any of these targets. So to quickly summarize, space is no longer the sanctuary it once was. Politicians and military planners alike need to realize that and take this into account when making policy, acquisition, and operational decisions. China is now a near-peer competitor in space with a rapidly expanding capability to close the advantage gap that the US, NATO, and even Russia has enjoyed for decades. They view this as the new strategic high ground and as a critical domain in international strategic competition. And their space programs are either controlled by or made available to the armed wing of the Communist Party, which is the People's Liberation Army, largely through the Strategic Support Force. And China realizes the vast importance of space situational awareness and understands that even civil, commercial, and scientific aspects have military applications. So with that, we'll leave it there and leave time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. Now I would like to introduce our final panelist, Julia Baum, who is a PhD student in Freeman Air and Space Institute in the School of Security Studies, King's College London. Her research examines the UK's space posture and assesses the UK's approach towards space policy making in the new space age. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks to the Atlantic Forum for having me on the panel. Space domain's state's quite thrilling and full of opportunity. And as the last speaker, I'll try to wrap it up quickly and try to maintain your enthusiasm. But as a researcher and PhD candidate at King's, I'll be speaking more as an academic and on the developments of the UK because that's my expertise. But it does have a lot to relate to NATO and the space security environment at large. No actor in space operates in isolation, and it's this recognition of how sustainable access to space rests at the core of space power. So to first speak briefly on the recent developments in the UK, there's been quite a lot of action worth discussing, and just to bullet point a few, the 2021 Integrated Review recently outlined that space is taking a front seat in scientific enthusiasm and investment moving forward. And then in 2020, Director of Space to the Ministry of Defense, and in April 2021, a newly established Space Command and command the formation of the National Space Council in 2020 and the Space Landscape Review in 2020, assessing how space is governed across HMG. And this is just to quickly name a few recent developments in the UK alone. An ambitious medium-level space power, as some like to say, though this terminology is quite contested, and feel free to ask in the Q&A if you want to elaborate on tier terminology and language. But to go back to the UK Space Command, this was established on April 1st, really only 9 days ago, demonstrating coherence across UK space. The command is still in its early informative stage, and there's a lot to come in the next few years. If you're curious what the command's intent is, they posted it on Twitter, and it's worth it to have a glance if you're interested. But I'd also like to note here that the US space plans yesterday to establish a Space Systems Command in LA for technologies and satellite launch services. This will oversee about 10,000 people redesignated from the Space and Missile Systems Center. So this is another major shift in Space Command structure. And just to go back to the UK, with Air Vice Marshal Harvey Smith appointed as the director of space, these new roles that are demonstrating active attention to the ways in which countries, particularly as I'm discussing the UK, want to position themselves as a space power, and for the UK in a post-Brexit world. And this is a world now where cooperation and collaboration are championed, while sovereignty in certain respects is recognized as something of uncontested value. And these are also emboldened through Brexit, as there are now Brexit-informed approaches to asset building through more sovereign approaches, demonstrated most keenly, as Brendan had mentioned, with Galileo, and now the UK trying to set up OneWeb to be horizon with Galileo. Galileo being Europe's global navigation and satellite system, providing civilian-controlled position accuracy. With Brexit, the security sharing terms and conditions now have changed. UK remains a member of the European Space Agency. There's a different security interaction between Europe and Britain that has shifted, and the UK has to pour effort into another Galileo with sovereignty at the crux of the forward to with OneWeb moving forward, though. But it makes us really look that, Brexit is very real. The UK is still a member of ESA, and while this does require a reshuffle of security space assets, it does encourage a degree of sovereignty and other alliance and partnership building. And I personally think that the ways that the UK and the US are looking to collaborate in, say, space situational awareness is a great start moving forward, especially with Five Eyes to build secure communications, share information, and coordinate actions for interoperability at its core. So this really demonstrates that it's necessary to have resilience across political and governmental change. Priorities change, this we know, but investment in space must be strategic in order to ensure longevity. Also, to point out one more point of the UK space program, with launch at the center of UK space discourse and ambitions at the moment, it's clear that industry incentives such as closing up the chain and prioritizing resilience in the UK is at the forefront. And this is a business model that also acknowledges how civil and commercial are ways that the UK must approach a webbed space national posture. No space asset operates in isolation to another, and this type of coordination isn't easy, but it's necessary to communicate motivations, needs, and wants across the UK space sector. And this includes commercial, civil, government, and military engagement. So to now take a bit of a divergence, but still on the same track, I just want to briefly touch on space security. A more universal concern, but it's something of grave importance when talking about investments in space assets and space development. I mean, there is very little reason to invest in something which can break easy or destroy. And the most grave threat to assets in our skies is orbital debris, a very hot topic at the moment, but for very good reason. I mean, just 2 days ago, tracking brought attention to a potential collision of 2 inactive space objects that would have generated over 4 million fragments. OPS 6182, a meteorological satellite, and SL8RB, a rocket body, missed by under 10 meters, a scaled probability of 20%. And these types of occasions are only set to increase as we put more satellites in orbit. It's also that we could run out of space in space. The situation with increasing satellite launch is that there's now extreme competition for real estate in orbit. With mega constellations and increased launch, the amount of parking spots in space proves to be finite, with asymmetric infinite ambition. And on the commercial side, with, say, Musk and Bezos entering space in such massive quantity, clutter and even more congestions to come with mega constellations and increasing launches. And this begs for responsible activity in space, hence the UK's recent push for the UN resolution on responsible behaviors in space. But to note, ambitious move. It's also quite ambiguous and difficult to pin down a common assessment of what exactly defines responsible behavior. And the one thing that's consistent is a universal agreement that orbital debris would render the space environment inoperable. Orbital debris has a very real potential to degrade the environment and render it useless if action isn't taken to monitor and regulate uses of the orbital highway. Of course, the first step many are taking is to enhance space domain awareness, SDA and SSA, to ensure we actually know what's out there in order to categorize threat levels and predict accurately. Small paint chips, for instance, are incredibly small debris, rendered untraceably dangerous and destructive. But it's in nobody's favor to destroy this environment. And I often quote the proverb, don't poison the well from which you drink, but it's fitting to use this as in a congested environment. And I suppose, to bring a bit of academic devil's advocate, we can't assume that everyone's dependence and valuation of space and that space infrastructure threatened by debris is a consistent threat to each operating space power. This makes the omnipresent responsible behavior quite difficult to pin down through common language, approaches, ambitions, reliance on others, and individual motivations. For example, the US tends to see counter space weapons as a one-way street. Once used, it's very difficult to bounce back from that type of escalation. While China, on the other hand, escalation that can dial up and down. I guess a reference that I could make would be the 2007 anti-satellite test on their weather satellite, which still has tons of debris in orbit. So our lenses and approaches differ, which is why discussions and communications need to be held between powers to ensure the environment remains operable. Actors' space ambitions are multifaceted and diverse, and we can't assume that every post-Cold War emerging space power wants to become the next US, Russia, or China. It costs a lot to participate. In cooperation and collaboration fills these gaps for many countries looking to expand space presence in smaller degrees than others. So the main threat for space security would be orbital debris. Rendering orbit, especially low Earth orbit, into a cosmic junkyard would hold catastrophic consequences for any country reliant upon weather satellites, atomic clocks, banking, communication, as well as effective defense, crisis response, and disaster relief. So, while we invest in the assets in our skies, the pertinent issue in security is the longevity and resilience of these assets. Sustainable space is the bedrock for a thriving space economy, But without continued and accessible operations, space assets that we choose to invest in will not be worth very much. I mean, there's a lot more to say about what best practice should be in orbit, but the truth is we're really at a formative stage where everything is currently quite flexible. We have time to change our approaches and make strategy more sustainable before we cross that debris line of no return. And as just to touch briefly on other counter-space weapons, I don't have, that can certainly be raised in the Q&A. Brendan touched on it briefly with anti-satellite kinetic, non-kinetic, but when discussing national approaches to space power and acquisition, costs for counter-space weapons are quite low. Dual-use technologies make it increasingly difficult to attribute adequate assessments of intent and determining adequate threat perceptions. Because technology is technology, what shifts it and what makes it a higher use. So this is the complicated symphony that is the space age today, and it's all mixed into the bucket of opportunities and threats that we have to get better acquainted with moving forward. And as I mentioned, this is a formative stage. We don't really have many examples for space activity or events, and theory tends to connect back to sea or land domains due to a lack of specific and sufficient theory for space itself. But these will all develop in the coming years, and there's a lot of space to grow. So I'll leave this here, and hopefully we have some time for Q&A left. But thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Sorry, just give me a moment. Let's start with the first question. Flavio, not many countries or not many members in the NATO alliance have comprehensive space capabilities, for example, compared to the US or France. Within the alliance, how do you cooperate with NATO members that do not have the same space capabilities? They might have some, but not at the same scope. And then how would you even start developing the concepts of interoperability and standardization, especially as some countries use space-based assets for different requirements, multi-domain operations, ISR, and in regard to that, NATO is a consensus-based organization?
Thank you for
this question. Well, I think that this is one of the strength points of for NATO. As was mentioned in by the previous speakers, one of the main aims is to improve education. So I think that the starting point in developing national capabilities in countries that at the moment have no capability or very, very small capabilities would be to have their military personnel joining NATO exercises or training initiatives. We also have many educational initiatives that are aimed at in improving the knowledge of space systems, their use within NATO, but also more in general. And with respect to norms, standard procedures, standardization, this is definitely a pretty big question. NATO, and especially NATO HQ, of course, is the venue for discussing all these aspects. So, of course, it's putting together the opinion of 30 nations is not easy, but bit by bit, this aim will be definitely achieved. One pro of this, of the fact that there are few countries owning space assets or space capabilities in general, is that it's easier if you think about it. The other countries will follow what these countries are suggesting. So paradoxically, space is, from this point of view, easier than other domains, because many countries are really just following what is advised to them, what the more technologically advanced nations are already have already developed. So it's definitely a debate ongoing, and it will keep growing in the future. But it is a challenge that NATO is definitely are ready to face.
Actually, further building on that question, I'll ask, of course, the other panelists, but I want to build on your answer because we've got varying space capabilities, of course. When we're, say, for example, let's just take an example. If there's a shift of a member's interest, for example, if the US focuses its attention to the specific, while other NATO members are looking at the traditional threats, eastern flank, southern flank, for example, and then there has to be a priority and allocation of space-based assets because it's not an infinite number. There's a limited number of space-based assets. Would that pose a challenge for the alliance in the future?
It is definitely a challenge. There are mechanisms already in place to give command and control to NATO of national assets, including satellites. And I'm thinking about what I can actually say. But the new NATO Space Center in Ramstein is covering also this role, among others. And there is definitely an issue with prioritization, but hopefully the increase of space capabilities, especially on the commercial side, will ease this issue. We are, I think that among the 6 functional areas that I mentioned in my presentation, the most advanced one within NATO is satellite communications. And for this capability specifically, we have a good mix of national and commercial capabilities. And this is aimed especially at ensuring the service, because nations might have different priorities than NATO's, and while commercial companies base their provision of services on the contract. So if we have an allocated capability, a secure service, then we can really rely on
that. Thank you for the answer. Now next, Dennis, with your job, I assume Flavio has touched upon it. Big data presents a huge challenge. Data collection, processing. How do you overcome the challenges of big data? And has the center also tackled with big data projects? And how can we ensure that data is processed in a timely manner and given to the decision makers? And on top of that, how would AI be the future solution in processing multi-source data?
Sorry. Yes, thank you, Geoffrey. We are involved in several projects, such as in the Horizon 2020 or Horizon Europe program, which are focused on how to tackle this issue of big data, and of course we are implementing progressively methods using big data within platform for processing those data at the satellite center. This is obviously connected also with artificial intelligence, as one of the issue with multiplicity of the data we have to manage today, because we are geospatial intelligence, so our main source of data, of course, is a satellite imagery, very high resolution satellite imagery. But we have to we have also to fuse those data with other sources, which could be data which come from the user, from the field. So in situ data, which could be also social network data. cartographic, topographic data, whatever is available in order to get a better, I would say, analysis on and to better respond to the question of the user. So yes, we are currently working on platforms which would gather those different flow of data from the different sources, integrated and put them at the disposal of the image analysts, and this using also artificial intelligence in order to ease, I would say, the sorting those data, because it becomes quite difficult for a human and for human analysis to select, to extract, and to analysis. So we really count on big data and artificial intelligence to ease the work of the analyst.
Thank you very much. Now, Brendan, there's a lot of information to process in regards to Chinese space capabilities. However, let's start with one of the key things that we've seen over the past years. The China National Space Administration has been increasing a lot of efforts to bolster its relationship with countries around the world. So I've read that China signed 21 civil space cooperation agreements with 37 countries and 4 international organizations. To one side, we can understand international cooperation and the benefits of information sharing and lessons learned, but would this also increase the risk and vulnerabilities to a potential adversary or a competitor in space when you're sharing sensitive information?
Right, and that's really the crux of the problem that we face, is how do you find a way to cooperate on science, which is good for all mankind, but it also has these dual capabilities, as we and China has explicitly discussed. This is one of the reasons that the U.S. law prohibits NASA from cooperating with China's National Space Administration. Is just because all of these capabilities and technologies are so intertwined, it's really impossible to de-link them. And because the Chinese system is just simply different. It's not better or worse. It's just simply different, and they're able to more easily integrate these things. And so that's really the challenge that we face: is how do we find those areas? And it's specifically, it's going to become a bigger and bigger problem, not just scientifically but commercially. Right, so scientific, you can probably figure out ways to do, missions to Mars or space science that are going to be fairly limited. But once you talk about commercial applications, like Flavia was talking about, communications, imagery, all these things that come online in the commercial realm, how do you separate those out when those are very easily made available to other national defense and security apparatuses? So it's something we're going to continue to struggle with. But it absolutely is a concern, because all of that information and those technologies are very easily transferred. Unlike in the past, where we weren't so concerned about you taking a Ford Escort and turning it into a tank. The technologies involved in space are all high tech and all easily transferable from space to science, and to commercial, and then back to the military.
Thank you very much. A very tough question, unfortunately. Julia, orbital debris. It's a fascinating topic, of course, but are we able to even remove orbital debris or even clean it up? Because I'm imagining the costs will be unbearable for any nation or any international organization.
Actually, a lot of activity happening right now for orbital debris mitigation. Astroscale launched something recently to catch and bring back debris. There are quite a few ambitious programs to start attacking this issue. But I think what I find most complicated about it would be the dual use technology of it. So you build a satellite that has some sort of robotic arm that can maneuver or grab debris, or, you know, a maneuverable satellite that can, once zombie, maneuver itself out of orbit, deorbit itself. That in itself is quite ambiguous, and it is a weapon. So the technologies that we're developing to solve space problems, including debris, I mean, this might be the biggest problem, yes, but the solutions themselves we have to make sure are foolproof before we create more problems than just orbital debris. We put all these robotic, maneuverable satellites with fancy gadgets on them that we don't actually know has the potential yet to weaponize, because potential itself is also a weapon. So this is the question. I mean, Reagan back in the day thought about the fishnets, you know, where you could grab it with a fishnet and then sort of fish it back to Earth. But say, for instance, you launch something into space to go collect debris, and on its way to go collect debris, that object itself explodes. Now you've created more debris, but your intent was not to. That complicates the whole activity of debris collection or mitigation itself. So it's tough. It's a thin rope to walk, but I think because we have a lot of attention, especially this year. I mean, 2020, 2021 has been super ambitious for space, that there are a lot of startup companies looking at this issue in particular. And I have a lot more faith in the next year or so that maybe there'll be something that we can create for the debris problem that will also not tread into the waters of weaponization.
Thank you. Now a question for all of you, and this is a very broad question. We've seen that NATO has declared space as its fifth domain of operations in 2019. NATO Secretary General stated NATO has no intention to put weapons in space. We are a defensive alliance. We've heard from Flavio, NATO wants a secure environment. Now, the big question is, we've seen competition, China, Russia, investing in huge amounts into unconventional weapons, such as the hypersonic missile, for example. And they're looking to find a competitive advantage. However, NATO declaring that space is a fifth domain, is there an inherent risk that adversaries will not interpret NATO's way, that it's going to be even further investing in non-conventional technologies that could trigger a arms race in space? And everyone's feel free to answer.
Well, I would say real quickly, they're already doing it. I don't think NATO recognizing reality is going to change any trajectory. And one of the fundamental problems we have is just simply the words we use and our understanding of what a space weapon is different from those of China, different from those of Russia. You know, and it can be very broad as to anything that affects space, which could include terrestrial. So is an attack on a ground tracking station, is that a space weapon? Is malicious code sent up? Is that a space weapon? But I don't think that Russia and China really care one way or the other whether or not NATO recognizes this as a domain or not. They're going to continue doing it because at the end of the day, it's the information and the assets that matter, and it's in their own national interests. So.
Further building on your answer, and anyone could also answer this. Do we need to start rethinking the role of deterrence, or what actually, say, for example, in NATO, there's of course Article 5, but let's take any sort of military action against space-based assets. Would an action against a space-based asset trigger a potential response, and how would that response even look like? And we are also even talking about the concept of attribution. And do we need to completely rethink? Okay, there's a small satellite, it got blown up. Is that do we have to rethink deterrence?
This is a good question. It's $1 million question. It's under discussion at NetHQ. legal offices are really working hard on this for sure. But I think that, again, NATO has its own mechanism. It was mentioned several times that space is different, and space is actions in space will be considered differently from the legal point of view. Attacking space will be considered differently. I don't think so personally. I think that space will be treated exactly as the other domains. There will be a consultation, and again, this is my personal opinion based on what I heard, and but I'm convinced that the space domain will follow what the cyber domain is doing, the same approach, because the challenges, for example, the attributability is very similar. So probably the decision on whether to apply Article 5 to an attack, in the case of an attack to a space asset, will be based on the consequence to that attack. So if that attack will be comparable to, I mean, if the, let me start over, if the consequence of an attack to a space asset will be comparable to the consequence of a more traditional attack, then probably the nation will agree on Article 5. And this is exactly what happened also with the cyber domain. So, and again, let me stress that this is my personal opinion, is not an official NATO statement.
Of course. And let me get, we're going to do a final round of questions. This is for Brendan. Of course, China, well, the PLA usually manages the China space program, investing in a lot of different aspects such as ISR, SATCOMs, and much more. China has a lot of state-owned civilian and military contractors, as well as Chinese commercial space companies receiving large amounts of investments over the past year. But we've also seen a peculiar shift that China is also trying to decentralize and diversify its space industry. Why is there a shift? Are they trying to increase competitiveness within their own industry?
So I would say they're not necessarily trying to decentralize, but they are indeed trying to grow that and make it more diverse. And the problem that we are challenged with when dealing with this is basically just the transparency of who's behind these companies, what are the companies actually doing. China does not have necessarily the same transparency rules, especially just even on the commercial side for investment that the United States and Europe does. And so these are challenges to find out who are the actual stakeholders, where is the information, where is the funding coming from, and where are those information going back to. But China absolutely sees the space economy as a huge and growing sector, and they want a part of it. The question is, how do they disentangle it? Military civil fusion is a state policy. The Chinese government just recently promulgated opinions on improving the party work within commercial companies. So each private company, regardless if it has a state-owned enterprise as a backer or not, is required to have a Communist Party cell, which basically functions as a shadow board, if you will. And so these are all the kinds of things that we're doing. But I don't think I would characterize it at all as decentralizing. But they are certainly trying to expand the reach and the number. And just real quickly on the previous question, the only other things that I would think about are, space-based assets are largely unmanned. We're assuming it's not going to be an attack on a space station, but on a satellite. And this is the same problem we're facing with drones, right? So the Iranians shot down a drone, but President Trump called off an attack on a physical location that had launched from the drone because potentially we were going to lose human life over that. And he didn't think that that was worth jeopardizing human life over something that wasn't human. And certainly space, although far more expensive than a drone, is going to have those same problems. And then as Julia has outlined, the problem with attacking something in space, because of an attack in space, you create more of that same debris, which creates problems for everyone, including yourself. So, and I know Julia had some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly point from the other previous point. I'm not so much answering this question as adding more questions, but if you're going to start thinking about space deterrence, concept. You have to know if there's going to be a degree that's considered aggression. Is there a threat scale? And can you have red lines in space that if crossed, there has to be? So how does existing international law apply to space? Are there countermeasures that are internationally wrongful acts in space? And these are undefined largely. Sorry, I think I might be frozen. But yeah, so just going into the space deterrence theory, I don't think it's hard to know if there will be a line that can be crossed in space, whereas if we're going to start talking about attribution or what is really happening in space, if we even know, because it's hard to source back jamming sources or spoofing sources, because you can get these little disks from Radio Shack for quite cheap, and jammers can affect downlinks quite easily. That it's really poisonous spaghetti that's hard to untangle. So I'm really just adding more questions to this, but defining those lines to cross, if we're going to start thinking about at what point can you take action or respond at parity or symmetrically, defining those lines is, from my stance, is really the first step.
Thank you very much. And now I'm just going to do a final round, a final question, and this is for each speaker. So you could, this will be like your closing answer. Hearing all of you guys, space, it's a young field, almost like the Wild West. There's a lot of things that we have to answer. How do you see space evolve over the next 10 years? Are you optimistic, or do you have a healthy dose of pessimism? Let's start with Dennis.
It's quite difficult to predict where space will move. But I'm working for 20 years, more than 20 years at the EU Satellite Center. But so I can already, I have an insight of how much space has bring to the security, at least in the EU area, and it has been great. And I've seen this very strong evolution. We were starting with very few satellite imagery to work on specific question over some places in the world, already working, for example, counter weapons of mass destruction, conflict, etc. But at that time, the frequency of the information we could get to deliver actionable intelligence to the actors in the field was quite limited. Even using the governmental satellites, because we had access already to some of the member states' governmental satellites. Today, I think the picture is completely different. We got several images, sometimes on the same points in the Earth per day. We can integrate a lot of other sources of data, and we are in a permanent link with our users. They give us feedback, and there is a kind of dynamic which is in place, which did not exist clearly even 10 years ago. And this is moving quite fast. So I think that I'm quite optimistic. I see that we have, at least for the mission of the Satellite Center, the core mission, geospatial intelligence, we are progressing, and it's really, we are becoming a key asset for the daily life, I would say, of our users. And at the same time, I say that one of the key issues, and it has been highlighted several times today, is to protect our space assets, both, I would say, from risk which would not, I mean, like, such as a collision, etc., on orbit, but also to protect them from intentional attacks. And I see really a challenge here. And if you are able to really well protect our infrastructure, I'm quite optimistic for the future. Yes.
Yes, I think that I agree that I'm more optimistic than pessimistic. There's always this note of pessimism based on a potential ripple effect due to debris, for example. But I don't see. I think that space is really an example of how the world can collaborate together. I think it's a win-win situation for all, and nobody really would like to or would have an advantage in having space services denied. So I think that more and more space will go commercial and could be really comparable compared with what happened with cyber. So in the next 10 years, I think there will be for sure a huge increase in activity in space, mostly commercial. There will be a much more tangible impact, let's say more tangible benefits stemming from the use of especially artificial intelligence, because the amount of data that will come from space will be enormous. So I'm pretty optimistic. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm incredibly optimistic. I think the scientific discoveries that we're going to make, the ability to link the world with communications, to open up areas that currently don't have access. We're going to improve people's lives. We're going to bring people together. We're going to allow communities and villages in Asia and Africa and South America to link to the greater economy that'll help bring them forward in development. I'm very optimistic through all of these things, the commercial, the scientific, the academic, all the advances we're going to make. And the only thing we need to do is just keep in mind that and let our partners and friends and allies around the world know and understand the backside challenges to national security and defense. But I think that among cooperative nations that share the same outlook, the same view on human rights and things like that, if we work together, I see almost nothing but upside. And as long as we're just smart about how we do it, we should be able to manage all of these challenges just like we have in the past. So.
Yeah, I'm also quite optimistic. The security is a pessimistic field for obvious reasons. So sorry if my talk was largely pessimistic about debris, but I am quite optimistic that there'll be development on that front as well. I think there's a lot of investment also, not only in STEM for space, but for new space policy, new space law, and qualitative thinkers that are thinking about why we're doing what we're doing in space and trying to contextualize it not only for our ambitions today, but hopefully for a sustainable future. So I see a lot of really great things happening also for the structures of command. And as long as we're pocketing our interests where what serves us and isn't a bit too uncalculated, say if we're going to start settling permanently on Mars, this is a massive amount of money that would be spent that we could be spending on Earth and isn't necessarily contextualized or thought through with the qualitative thinkers that hopefully will be surfacing in the upcoming years. But that being said, I'm really quite optimistic as well. There's a lot happening in space, and there's a lot more panels happening and a lot more discussion happening the past year, which is thrilling. So I am.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have to finish it, unfortunately, here as we are over time. So thank you for your fascinating presentations and your answers. And on behalf of the Atlantic Forum, I would like to thank you all for taking your time to be here. It's very much appreciated.